But thank you all for being here today. My name is Katie Monty. I have been with the Office of Disability Services for almost 19 years, been here for a while. And I have a background in social work and spent most of my career working with individuals with disabilities in various environments. When I came here, I worked directly with students with disabilities that needed accommodations to access their academics or to access our campus, and did that for a while, and then transitioned eventually into the role that I'm in now. So I provide some leadership under Gina Smith, who's our Director of Disability Services, and I am considered the accessibility, like, compliance consultant for everybody on campus. So in terms of the services that our campus provides and the programs that we have for students, employees, and visitors, I'm meant to be sort of the point person around the federal and state requirements that help prevent discrimination towards people with disabilities. I have, and this is part of my agenda here, I have to do a bit of a disclaimer as we go through this today. My background is 80% physical accessibility. However, as our technology has developed and as a society we've developed, we are the new frontier, so to speak, that can contribute to discrimination towards people with disabilities is the digital world. And that really is something that is important that we all work on. It's a form of accessibility rather than an individualized accommodation. And there is a new final ruling with the federal government as of April of next year. They're going to have some new requirements around things being accessible to people with disabilities at the digital level. And so it's this good timing to be here today. But the disclaimer that I have is that my background, as I mentioned, is social work. It is not IT. What we have learned as we continue to progress towards spreading the word around digital accessibility and the importance of it is that our institution needs a dedicated role for that. And it should be someone with an IT background. That's not me. So we are hoping that we will be able to convince leadership of a position that will be dedicated solely to digital accessibility, training, promotion, and IT problem solving for those who are really trying to make their content accessible, but need some help doing that. So it's important that I mention that because I'm going to give you some basics today. But when it comes down to, like, you're working on your website, you're working on remediating a really tough PDF to make it accessible, there are times where I have to refer people to IT for some assistance with that. Okay, so I have a quick video I want to show you real quick, which is a good overall summary of why this information is important and how we get reference to what is accessible from a digital standpoint. If I can hit that, yes.
Imagine if 90% of the websites or mobile apps you use today locked you out. Everyone else continues to experience the convenience of mobile banking, the connectedness of social media, and the freedom of online shopping. But for you, they're inaccessible. For the 57 million people with disabilities in the United States, this is their everyday experience. People with visual, auditory, motor, speech, and cognitive disabilities rely on various assistive technologies and alternate methods of interaction to use digital documents, web, and mobile apps. People with visual disabilities may rely on screen readers, braille displays, Zoom functions, or high contrast colors to get value from what's displayed on screen. People with auditory disabilities often rely on captions or transcripts for video content. People with motor disabilities might require speech-to-text software or keyboard-only interactions. People with speech disabilities require a non-vocal means of interaction. And finally, people with cognitive disabilities often require thoughtful and organized layouts with clear direction. Digital accessibility is the practice of making digital documents, web, and mobile apps accessible to everyone, including people with disabilities. Accessible sites and apps are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Building accessible sites or apps can be tricky without the right guidance. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, published by the W3C, is the standard rule set that defines what makes a site accessible. Developers, testers, app owners, and accessibility experts from around the world rely on these standards for proper accessibility testing direction. In fact, many U.S. federal government agency sites and apps are required by law under Section 508 to be accessible. This law includes the WCAG standard. In the U.S. and European Union, WCAG is being adopted across private sector businesses as well. Whether you're following legal requirements or proactively working to make the web a better place, practicing digital accessibility makes a real difference for millions of people. To start making your site more accessible, try the free Axe browser extension or reach out to your local accessibility community for other recommendations on where to start. DQ, accessibility for good.
Okay. I'll mess it up here by clicking. Okay, so that's just an overview. WCAG or WCAG is sort of the massive reference guide for digital accessibility. It's very similar to building codes relative to physical accessibility, and it's a good big document to put you to sleep. It's very technical, but it is the guideline that we're expected to follow. So when we're talking about different types of media, obviously we convey information in lots of different ways. More and more we're doing that in a digital world, right? We don't have so many flyers, paper flyers anymore. It's more through digital content. So we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about types of text as you were creating documents. So oftentimes creating your document from the beginning can incorporate more accessibility than trying to remediate your document later. And it can be a lot easier to make sure it's accessible if you approach it from the very beginning of the content that you're creating. So talking about fonts, let's talk about accessible fonts. What are accessible fonts? What are not considered accessible fonts? Would anybody venture to say, like, which of these do you feel would be accessible or is not accessible?
I feel like Lucida Console would be accessible.
Okay, what makes you think that?
Actually, now I'm not sure because the L's in illustration could be tricky, so.
Good catch.
I was trying to, because I'm seeing a lot of like in the word illustration.
Yes.
I feel like that's the one that's causing the issue for accessibility in terms of differentiation between letters.
That you are spot on. So you've already caught, so to speak, one of the telltale things that helps differentiate accessible fonts versus inaccessible fonts. When we talk about accessible fonts, we are primarily thinking about people with visual or vision-related disabilities and how can they access this content. If they rely on what we call text-to-speech software, it's often referred to as screen readers as well. Or if you have someone who has what we call low vision and requires significant magnification of their text, then as we start to look at font types, it can really play a role in how clear that information is being read by a screen reader or by a software. So you caught the ILL. In general, it is best to use sans serif fonts with your documents. And two that are pretty popular are Verdana and Arial. Verdana, by design, is a tish larger as well. And we're gonna talk about font size in just a minute. But as you can see, they don't have what they call the tails or the flares that some of these have. Times New Roman technically has flares. Times New Roman is like the Mac Daddy everybody's supposed to be using and is required in some areas. I do think that has changed and that is continuing to change where you're allowed to use a sans serif font for certain requirements of reference, but Times New Roman is not great. And again, it's because of these little tails, these little flares that you can see there. Arial, even though it is a sans serif font, is not ideal, depending on, you know, what type of assistive technology you're using. So to your point, Michelle, illustration, Arial is sans serif, but what does the word illustration, I mean, up here look like?
Illustration.
Exactly. And that might be how a screen reader reads it, is illustration. Where at least with Verdana, it is differentiated from capital and lowercase. What also can be difficult for screen readers are monospaced fonts. It makes it hard for the computer to understand where a word ends and where the next one begins, and so it might not read it correctly. We also want to avoid fonts that are capitalized or condensed, and probably safe to say these are not considered very accessible fonts. And the older I get, honestly, the harder these are for me to read, just from my progressive vision loss. Okay, how about text size? Now this is the presentation, obviously, projecting it on a very large screen, but let's think about your document or your web pages that you're designing. What do you think is a good average size for your text? Can anybody read the first one at 8 points? I cannot. But does anybody have an idea? There's sort of a best practice or a recommended size. Anybody have an idea of what that is from an accessibility standpoint?
For a website?
Well, it can be for a website, most commonly for a
For
document.
a document, okay.
Yeah,
Is it 12?
yes, it is 12. Oh, it is 12 points. So I mentioned that Verdana is a larger font by design. So if you decided to use Verdana, you could use a little less than 12 points. But 12-point font size is the rule of thumb, generally speaking, for documents. And that, again, the size might be more easily accessed by people with visual disabilities. And it might even eliminate their need for magnification software if it starts at 12 points. That can be tricky when your documents are really long, right? It can make them certainly longer, but it is considered an important rule of thumb, generally speaking. Another thing to keep in mind in terms of your content being accessible is not using color as the only way of presenting content. And again, going back to text-to-speech or computer screen readers, they are unable to read or understand a text that is a different color. And so when it's reading to someone who is completely blind, they have no way of knowing what is important if you say all required questions in red are mandatory. That used to be a real common way that we might put information or present information, but that wouldn't be accessible by everyone. So options are, you can use an asterisk, which is read by a screen reader, or you can put in parentheses before the question or at the end of the question, mandatory, which will also be read by a screen reader. And then in terms of presenting data, patterns can be helpful for people who have vision. that maybe color blindness is not really considered a disability, but it could be useful for someone who's colorblind to understand the data if it's in patterns. And that can be easier to see the differences in the data when there's patterns and not just colors. All right, let's talk about color contrast. This is my soapbox.
Mhm.
Can anybody read this bullet point here? I need to start changing like the sentences because I asked and I don't know. But can anybody really see that? That is very, what we call low contrast ratio between the color of the text and the background. The one in the middle is better, but it still does not meet that WCAG, WCAG standards that I mentioned, and could be difficult for some people based on a visual disability to see clearly. A contrast ratio of 6.6 to 1 is ideal. Now, probably wondering, how would I ever know what that is? I've shared these slides with Aura, so y'all will have these and you can use these links. But there is, and I have this as a reference, listed as a reference at the end as well. There's a really cool website called webaim.org, and it has a lot of helpful information in it. One of the things it has is a color contrast checker. So if you're creating something on your website or creating a colorful document, you can plug in the RGB or the hex number of your colors, and it will tell you if it passes or fails WCAG. I say WCAG, but I know the video said WCAG. Anyway, you can plug in your colors, and it will let you know if it's high contrast or not. And if it's not high contrast, it has the little slider bars that you can adjust the colors until they do pass and are high color contrast. I mentioned that's a soapbox for me, and the reason why, on our campus, our branding colors are tricky, right? We have that deep dark green, we have gold, and then we have white. Gold on the green, like gold text on a green background, or gold text on the white background, if you're using our color of gold, never passes color contrast. So by the time you use the sliders and they get dark enough that it passes, it's brown. It's just a dark brown. So the rule of thumb that I recommend to everyone is not to use our gold color for text in any situation, really. Use it as decorative, but I wouldn't recommend using it to convey information. You can use our green on a white background. That's a good high color contrast, like my title here. Or you can do the opposite. You can do our dark green background with white text, and that also is a high color contrast. Black text on our dark green background is not high contrast. And we have that in a lot of places. We have that in physical signage on our campus, and we're slowly trying to get rid of it because it's not considered high contrast. High color contrast is considered one of the top issues or barriers to people with various types of visual disability. People who identify or are diagnosed as blind, there's a very big spectrum of blindness, and it's very rare that a person who is blind has literally no vision whatsoever. Most have some level of vision. And people who identify or are in the category of having low vision have vision that cannot be corrected by glasses. And so this color contrast impacts just about every user of content that might have a visual disability. Okay, I'm going to switch gears on you now and talk about alt text and image description. This is another fast trending, I'll call it, issue in the digital accessibility world. It is essentially making sure that on your documents, on your websites, when you have images, that you are either describing that image in what we call alt text in the background or in the coding of that, so that a screen reader will read aloud what that image is conveying. Or you have an image description below it, which might be much longer and by necessity needs to be very detailed. And again, you can do a deep dive into all the details of this, but the image description, the alt text is traditionally very short. It actually, in accessibility checkers that I'll show you in a minute, they're good about popping up, like, do you need alt text for this image? Here's what we suggest, like there's an AI generated suggestion. You can use that, or you can just delete it and come up with your own description. When you're doing alt text or image descriptions, you never need to say photo of or image of, because in the coding of alt text, the screen reader knows that it's an image and will say that first. We'll say photo of. So you don't want to say photo of. It only needs to do it once. And this is just more how to write some good text, how to do good alt text, keeping it short and sweet. And when you are just deciding what you want your alt text to say, again, it depends on what you're trying to convey. And so we're going to practice that for a second. So let's look at these images. If we needed to create alt text for these images, what are some suggestions for this one on the left? Anybody?
Group of balloons with Charlotte logo or
Yeah.
like
I would say something like celebratory outdoor decor with Charlotte displayed with balloons.
Sure. That's good too. So what if I am a balloon vendor, right? And I want to put this on my website, I might really describe this as multi-colored, large, small, medium balloons, multi-size balloons available in any color you want or whatever, It depends on what I'm trying to convey, right? If I am the undergraduate admission department, then I might say Charlotte balloon and light banner outside of admissions building. What about this one on the right?
service dog in cap and gown.
Yes, that's great. You might say this might be used as graduate crossing stage at UNC Charlotte commencement. Maybe, that's all you say. Maybe you are the vendor that makes cap and gowns for service animals, which there are, which is so cool. Then you might want to say size large cap and gown for service animal. So it depends on what you're wanting to talk about. I feel like sometimes people get a little stressed about alt text. Again, in the accessibility checkers that are built in some of the platforms we use, it will kind of help you by giving you some ideas. But don't feel that it has to be a perfect description. You just want to make sure that if someone is blind, they understand why this is in the middle of your content, essentially, or at the beginning or the end. Okay, reading order. This is primarily for websites, for PDFs, talking again about screen readers. We want to make sure that whatever content we're creating, it is being read correctly by the screen reader. And that can be hard to know, because if it's not designed in such a way where it's literally lists the order in which you want it to be read aloud. It might skip from UNC Charlotte Office of Disability Services, reasonable and appropriate accommodation. You know, so that also can sometimes play into like making sure you use headers and making sure you have some organization to your document so that a screen reader will read it correctly and not jump all over the place. Okay, I'm going to show you something else for reading order. This is a very quick way to just do at a glance how your website might be read by a screen reader. Screen readers can get very complicated, and actually someone who is trained to use a screen reader because of a visual disability goes through truly months, if not years of training. It is very specialized training. I'm not able to provide that. There are community organizations that do that. But I know a quick little way to just see, okay, if somebody was blind and they go to our website, what would the screen reader say to them, right? So the way that you can kind of check the general order is to click near, you know, where your content, and then just use the tab key. So do you see how it is going across? What it normally does, and this is where we need an IT person doing this work, is it will also, in some websites, it will highlight, it will outline with a white box each one as you're going along. So if that's how you would want a screen reader to work, then that might be good. Now we have movement on this site, and so that can sometimes confuse a screen reader. There's a way to, from a coding standpoint, to have it work correctly, but generally speaking, that can be confusing. So now we've got a little text box here. See how it's going essentially to the headings, to the hyperlinks. And now it's going over here on the right. So again, the order in which you want your website to be read by a screen reader is up to the creator, is up to the people that are responsible for conveying the information on the website. But you do want to make sure that it's not something that skips all over the place, because then a person who is blind and is interested in, for example, our graduate school might say, oh, well, they're not really thinking about me coming there, I guess. So we want to avoid that, right? Okay. This is a bit of another soapbox of mine, or a pet peeve of mine. But generally speaking, we want to make sure that when we are conveying information for events, that we do so in a way that is inclusive for everyone. An example on the left is what I would call an inaccessible email. And what that involves is one sentence that says, please join us, details below. And then that document that's outlined here is an image, is a JPEG, or it is a PDF that has just been scanned and not made accessible. A screen reader would get to that document and would have nothing to say, because to the computer, there's nothing there, okay? Maybe even worse than that, there might be some sort of embedded link in there that is 4 or 5 lines long of just, you know, backslash, dot, you know, and then it's just going to read that whole thing. Still doesn't tell the person who wants this information anything about the event. So we as an institution are pretty guilty of this, and we send out things that people might very quickly go, oh, well, that's not for me, because I can't access the details of this event. The right one allows that creativity and the visual, you know, promotion of something but still provides the pertinent information in text. And I apologize, the way that I have this in a border makes it look like it's all one document. And I really need to change that because it looks like that's the flyer. But what it actually is, from this up, is an image. And it's an image somebody created for the event, right? And in the image, it's got all the details, which is nice for people that have vision. But below that are also the details for people who maybe can't access that image for whatever reason. This also might be helpful for people that learn better with visual text and not images, which can happen. And this includes everybody. Okay. Can you remind me, Aura, how long I have?
Until 12.
Till 12. Okay, just wanted to make sure. So I mentioned earlier that there are built-in checkers for lots of different documents. And I know I was talking about WebAIM earlier. WebAIM has the color contrast checker. It also has tons of other tools on there. And one of the tools that I'm going to open really quick is what we call, well, WebAIM calls the Wave tool for websites. It is a quick and more intuitive, okay. We have tried to sort of promote this tool for the average content developer for our websites in order to get just a quick report of how accessible is our website or a page of our website. So all you have to do is type in an address. I'm going to pick on the graduate school again. Let's see.
Graduateschool.charlotte.
Thank you. And what it will do is run a little quick report, and on the left-hand side, it will talk about, these might be some things that might be inaccessible. And it will start giving you some guidance as to what might be problematic and how to fix it. Some things are pretty easy to fix, like alt text, right? If you're like, oh, I forgot to put alt text on that image, you can work to do that. Some things are a little more complicated and you might need IT's help with it. But in general, you can open up all this information and get details. And then if you want to know, like, well, why does that matter? I don't really understand why that's a problem. You can click here on reference and it will tell you a little more why. So for example, errors, what this means. It's a link that contains no text, and it'll just explain to you all about why that might be problematic for some users with disabilities. It gets into some areas of IT and coding that I'm not able to address, but it can be a very helpful tool. We also, as you know, went from our Drupal website platform to WordPress. And my understanding is we're going to be going soon into a new iteration of WordPress for our websites, I think. But with WordPress, it also has an accessibility checker that is built in. And so often when you're creating content on your website, it's supposed to sort of pop up at the top and say, you've got some accessibility errors. Some of y'all are nodding. Have you seen that? Right. It can be pretty intuitive, in my opinion, as someone with a very non-IT background.
So can you explain, because I don't quite understand. So
Yes.
where it says like skipped heading level, it'll flag that on a website. And I assume that the same sort of saying might be flagged in like a PDF as well.
Yes.
But like, so what is the deal with the heading level?
So with headings, with website content, with PDFs, even with Word docs, it can be very helpful for lots of reasons to incorporate, I guess for lack of a better term, style. So that you are identifying pretty much everything in your document or website as heading level 1, 2, 3.
Oh, for the consistency, for the, okay,
Yes.
got it.
Yep, that's a great question. So screen readers in general, when you are a very facile screen reader user, you know keyboard shortcuts. So people who use screen readers, generally speaking, many of them access content that's digital completely via a keyboard. They don't use a mouse. They use keyboard shortcuts. They have memorized the keyboard for typing. And when you use one of the shortcuts that is available for screen readers is, like, for example, for one of them, you can hit H and a function key. It will pop up all the headings on that website, which is really nice because if you're blind and you need to know how to apply to the graduate school, you kind of want to go straight to how to apply, right? So you want that to be a heading that you can listen to all the headings and go, oh, I want that, rather than going what I call the long way around, which is letting the screen reader read every single word on every single page until you get to what you want. So I have seen over the years people using screen readers. It is fascinating. And when more time allows, we've done demos of screen readers in the past at our little workshops, and it's fascinating. People who use screen readers oftentimes have been using that as their way to access information since grade school. People who are blind, generally speaking, don't use Braille as much as they used to. So students that we see coming to post-secondary education are coming to us using technology like screen readers, not Braille. Every now and then we'll have someone who knows a little bit of Braille, but to Braille a textbook, it literally takes up like 2 bookshelves to have that Braille paper. And every now and then we have Brailled like a syllabus. We Brailled a syllabus for a PhD student years ago. The syllabus was like this thick. And it was just the syllabus, right? It becomes very hard if you're blind, particularly with the technology we have now. It can be very cumbersome if you don't use screen reader technology. And again, we had this PhD psychology student, and you can imagine the readings, right? I mean, you've got to know your shortcuts, and you've got to be able to skip around content. They listen to that speech being read to them at a rate that blows my mind. It is so fast. I have no idea what it just said, but they know because they're used to it. So back to your question with the headings. When you use styles and you have headings, not only does it allow the screen reader to give them an overall, essentially an outline of what your content is. And you all probably know this, but particularly with Microsoft Word, if you use styles, it will create your table of contents for you. And I always like to throw this out for people writing dissertations, because if you've written 30 pages and then your advisor just tore it apart and you need to make changes, you can do that and then just click a button and update your table of content rather than having to go through and change all the pages, and your table of contents is hyperlinked as well. That works great for the screen reader because they know where to go, but it works great for anybody who's like, yeah, I've read your first 10 pages. I want to know this chapter is where I need to go for the information. Yeah. Okay, so here's what we're going to do really quick. Resources again. And just share this with whoever you like is fine. Harvard has a good digital accessibility, set of resources. They were sued, and lost pretty much for not having content accessible. And so now they have a very robust set of resources. And so I highly recommend it. So now, and then I want to do questions, but I'm just going to show you really quickly. I'm going to close this as a presentation. And again, some of you might already know this, but when I mentioned built-in accessibility checkers, they are more and more available for just about every type of document you want to use. And for PowerPoint down here, if you see towards the bottom, do you see where my mouse is hovering and it says Accessibility Investigate? I click on that. And it also has an accessibility tab, which is awesome. We didn't used to have this when we first started sharing information about this. But if you see how it's going through and it's like, make sure your slide has a title. Make sure you've got reading order correct. And it will tell you all, you can learn more. It will do alt text. So for these things, you can, it's very similar to that WebAIM checker that I mentioned. You can click on things and it will tell you why that might not be accessible and how to fix it. So we were back to our balloon picture. Somebody wrote, again, this was AI, a large sign with balloons and trees in the background. Maybe, but if you're like, no, that's not the point of why I put that in there. You can just delete it, rewrite it, and then move on. It also has the opportunity for images for you to say, just mark it as decorative. So if for some reason your dissertation or your document that's very, very long needs to have the Charlotte logo on every page, probably don't need to put every single one of those. UNC Charlotte logo, UNC Charlotte logo. It's not really pertinent to the content, right? It's just maybe a requirement. So you can skip, mark it as decorative, and the screen reader won't read that. It's in there. You can do it for other images as well. So there's lots of things that the accessibility assistant will do for you. And when you have time, I think it's helpful to kind of go through here with maybe something short and just play around with the tools. This is another one. We were just talking about, reading order. What it's talking about reading order specific to PowerPoint slides is it going to read is it going to read the content on this slide the way I want it to? So obviously at the top I have common element, right? That's my title. But is the screen reader going to read that correctly? We have to look and see. And so basically this pops up and says, you just want to check this on all of your slides and make sure that that's what you want. And that's the order in which you want your content to be read. I found in Microsoft 365, I don't know if anybody's done this before, but the designer, like it will, on the right, it will kind of take your content and be like, oh, you can make it look like this, or you can make it look like this, and I get a little carried away with that. I'm like, oh, that's pretty, I want that. One thing I've discovered, it will take your order of your content, and I don't know what it does with it. It looks cool, but oh my gosh, it's like it will read number 3 before number 1 of your whatever you typed on there. So you have to be kind of careful about some of those features to make sure that it's conveying what you want it to. So this is sort of my basics. I'll go here to the end and just see, I'm really just sort of scratching the surface with this information. I think sometimes trying to make sure your content is accessible it definitely can add time to your already limited amount of time and resources with what you're making. But the more the more digitally, accessible your document is, the more people are going to feel like that they are included in that information and they won't feel discriminated against. The more accessibility checkers we have, the easier it is to do that. And I'll just add real quick for Adobe. PDFs, in my opinion, are definitely the most complicated thing to make accessible. The library probably has some of the hardest challenges because there are years and years and years of just scanned pages, and they are images. That's really, really complicated. And to make it from an image into an accessible document that can be read by a screen reader is very cumbersome. It's doable, but it's tough. However, if you have Adobe Acrobat Pro, which we all should have access to as employees and students, then they have now a built-in accessibility component that, while still a little less intuitive as the Microsoft products, is better. It's definitely better. So if you scan something and email it to yourself and you open it up as a PDF, if you open it up with Adobe Pro, it will now say, hey, this is an image. This is not accessible. Do you want to make it accessible? Click here, and it'll walk you through some steps. So it's getting better and easier to make things accessible more quickly than it used to be. Well, that's really my content. What about any questions for me?
I was wondering about like in documents like dissertations where there will
Yes.
be crazy complicated graphs and other things like that. Like, what do people do about that?
That's a great question. So what we recommend is you can use image description, which can be as long as you need it to be. Also often called maybe a caption below, but it's text that everybody sees, which is different from the alt text, which we don't see the alt text of an image. But the computer sees it and reads it. But then an image description allows you to go into some detail. If you have an enormous amount of detail, then what's often recommended is a hyperlink to a separate page that is text only, describing the data.
Okay.
Again, library, I've worked with some folks there over the years who were trying to make some things accessible, and one had anatomy of the eye in extreme detail. They were like, what do I do with this? And what we decided was best was just a hyperlink to a Word doc or a locked, even a PDF, as long as it's accessible, that basically explains it only in text, what it looks like. It can be very tricky to communicate data and graphs. That is by far the most difficult barrier, really, for people who are blind in general. Numbers are really hard for any screen reader to read correctly. When you have formulas, when you have different data things, a computer, generally speaking, doesn't know how to read that as the way it's supposed to be said aloud. They're working, and there's some text-to-speech programs that do better with numbers than others, but they're not in any way perfect. What we have found is that sometimes a human reader is still necessary to interpret really complex mathematical functions. With data in a dissertation, the best thing I can recommend is that hyperlink and just explaining it as best as possible. And it can be a summary, it can be a summary, but you just want to make sure that it's conveying whatever you're trying to explain. It's difficult.
I imagine like maps too.
Maps are very tricky, yes. They're getting better, but they're tricky. So our office, and this gets into an accommodation, this is an individualized type of service and not a form of accessibility. But there are times where we had a student who was blind and taking an anatomy class. And we got out the puff paint and the beans, and we made a tactile, pictures. Our student staff, they trace on a big piece of paper and they just, make it tactile. And then the faculty member would be like, number one is this, and we had it written out. Most people who spend a lot of time in math are either, had vision at one point in their lives and lost vision, or had a progressive type of visual condition. So they have an understanding of math at a visual level before they had to rely on it just to be spoken to them. But it's really tough. It's really tough. And you don't see a lot of people who are blind from birth going straight into math or engineering. Can be done, but it's extremely time, and requires an enormous amount of human intervention. So I don't have a really great answer to your question about the data, other than to do the best you can, if it needs to be in a separate link, to explain back to sort of like images, what are you trying to convey with this? And just explaining that. Some people have even gone so far as to like add their contact information.
I was just wondering that
Yeah.
actually.
That's totally fine, if you want to do that, just so they have somebody to reach out to just say, thanks for they probably might say, thanks for the description. Can you tell me a little more about graph number 2? Because I can't picture it right now. And sometimes that's just the way it has to be done. So there is, in efforts to make your content accessible, we are never, unfortunately, going to be able to anticipate and address every single individual disability impact. But we can just try to at least make it as accessible as we can to as many different users. Any other questions?
Lots to think about.
It can be a little overwhelming. And we struggle at here to just get this information out and for people to understand it and to utilize it. And it can be time consuming, but I will say, the more you kind of get used to doing it, the easier it can be, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. And feel free to reach out to me anytime. Thank you.
Thank you so much.